Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise to speak on third reading of the Budget Implementation Act. As I think all members of this House know, budgets are really where the government shows their hand and I think shows that, notwithstanding whatever they might say, what their real priorities are. So if we look at this Budget Implementation Act and what's in it, even if you compare it to what was in the budget document, so there were some things that they said they wanted to move ahead with in the budget document that are laudable, but then the question becomes, when it's time to actually put it into law and actually decide what we're going to move ahead with, is it there or not? Because if it's not there, then all Canadians get on those issues are the words in the budget document, which don't themselves do anything for Canadians and don't change anything. So if the government wants to say, as I believe they did in the budget document, that they're going to get hard on CEOs who are abusing tax loopholes in order to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, that's all well and good. We say that too. But if they're not going to put it in the implementation legislation to actually change the law that allows those CEOs to do that legally, then they're just words, Mr. Speaker. If they say, for instance, as they did in the budget document, that they're concerned about workers like workers at Sears, but of course we know that many other companies across many other industries, workers have faced a similar problem where the company declares bankruptcy and the money that was in their pension plan gets doled out to big banks and investors, or in some cases the very same CEOs who were underfunding the pension plan for years by taking holidays or by underfunding in other ways. That's all well and good for the government to say that they're concerned about that in the budget document, but when it comes down to it, what's happening there, even though it's absolutely wrong, Mr. Speaker, is legal. And the point of raising the issue and what it means to stand up for those workers is to say we're going to change the law so that's not legal anymore. And if that is done, then those companies can be pursued in court and made to face justice. And this Budget Implementation Act doesn't do that, even though they talked about the issue in the budget, Mr. Speaker. They brag about bringing in a new carbon pricing regime on the one hand, and then they tell you in question period many times over on the other that, well, don't worry, 85% of Canadians already live under a carbon pricing regime. So which is it, Mr. Speaker? Are they providing leadership on carbon pricing, or are Canadians largely already there? And I think there's a real tension in that message. And I think what's a glaring deficiency of the carbon pricing regime that they have proposed in this Budget Implementation Act is that for the fallback carbon price for provinces that don't already have their own system, the government hasn't proposed any kind of rebate system. Now we've seen in provinces like BC and in Alberta, where the NDP brought in a carbon price, rebate programs to ensure that low-income Canadians aren't disproportionately affected by a new carbon price. That's something that the government could have put into this legislation. It's something that we would have been happy to try and push harder at, although we've mentioned it certainly in the House before. But one of the things we tried to do was to actually take those carbon pricing provisions and break them out into a separate piece of legislation so that we could have more detailed study of those provisions. That would have provided the kind of avenue and opportunity to talk about a meaningful rebate program for low-income Canadians, including seniors who are living on fixed incomes and are going to be hit by this in provinces where they don't already have that regime, or in provinces that are going to bring in a carbon pricing regime but are not themselves bringing in a rebate program. We think that that would be appropriate, and the federal government could have modeled that in this legislation. But because they insisted on bringing in that pricing regime in an omnibus budget bill instead of breaking it out, we didn't have the kind of time that it takes to prepare those kinds of proposals. And that's one of the problems with these kinds of bills. Of course, Mr. Speaker, you'll know also, I've said this in the House many times, and I truly believe it. Part of the problem with omnibus bills, but also part of the problem with using time allocation in the way that this government has, frankly, setting records in terms of the amount that they use it and the short period of time that they allow after imposing time allocation is that civil society doesn't get the opportunity to weigh in on these bills. It's difficult enough for members of parliament who haven't had a lot of time to appreciate what's in a bill to do their due diligence, and we're supported. We're supported by the Library of Parliament. We have staff in our office, and even still we struggle, and in some cases, due to the time constraints imposed by government, aren't able to give the kind of study and perform the kind of due diligence that I think people expect of members in this place. But for people in civil society who don't have that kind of time and don't have those resources, are trying to educate themselves about what's happening here in Ottawa after work or between looking after their kids and all the many other things that Canadians do during a day, time allocation in this place makes it even harder for Canadians to engage in discourse about what's happening. Pensions are a big issue for folks where I'm from in Elmwood-Transcona, so it was a big disappointment to see that there was no legislative follow-through on the discussion of pension theft in the budget document. A rather weak discussion, I would say, but nevertheless, if you wanted proof that those words were weak and they didn't mean anything, the fact that there's nothing here, and particularly in light of the fact that there's nothing here when my colleague for Hamilton Mountain has already drafted the legislation that would be required in order to get this done, and that this government has taken the good ideas of some other NDP members and incorporated them into government legislation already. So that shows both that the legislation was there and ready to go, and that the government has the total capability of appropriating those private members' bills if they so choose. They decided not to move forward with it, and I think that's a disappointment to a lot of hardworking people across Canada, but particularly in Elmwood-Transcona, who I know, some of whom worked at Sears, but others who saw what was happening to employees at what was a kind of a long-standing institution at Kildonan Place Mall, and people felt that the workers who worked there for all those years ought to get a fair shake. It's disappointing not to see that. I think people in Elmwood-Transcona are disappointed too to see that the only thing that came of all the talk on pharmacare by this government was the establishment of a simple committee, and that there's actually no money even for that committee to operate. So maybe they'll find that money elsewhere. Why they wouldn't put it in the budget, though, in terms of being open and transparent about what the costs for that committee are actually going to be, I don't know, Mr. Speaker. And when we talk about fairness for workers and a Budget Implementation Act being an important opportunity for a government to signal its commitment to a good future for workers, where they can go out and get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, Mr. Speaker, we think of women across this country that have been waiting for a very long time to get pay equity. And again, pay equity was mentioned in the budget document, Mr. Speaker, but doesn't appear anywhere here. And we know that when we talk about pay equity, the debate for decades has centered on the need to bring legislation in. If this was going to happen spontaneously out of the goodwill of corporate Canada, presumably, it would have happened a long time ago. We know we need legislation. The budget document itself says we needed legislation. The budget document of 2016 said we needed legislation. The Liberals in the campaign in 2015 said we needed legislation. Here's another opportunity to have provided that legislation gone by. And people are rightly beginning to wonder if another election is going to go by before we see that legislation presented, Mr. Speaker. Pay equity is an important component of any real vision for the future in Canada where we manifest real fairness for workers, because you can't ignore over half the workforce and pay them less for doing work of equal value and pretend that you have fairness for workers in a country. So that's another example, Mr. Speaker, where this Budget Implementation Act simply does not live up to the kind of vision that the Liberals were trying to project in their budget document. So I forgive Canadians who maybe listen to the news coverage or even the budget debate and thought, wow, there's a lot of great stuff in there for workers, because the fact of the matter is that this doesn't really bring us closer to a fair future for Canadian workers. It ought to. That's why I came to Parliament. I know that's why my colleagues here in the NDP caucus came to Parliament. And we will continue to hold this government to account until we replace it.